Good afternoon, everyone, and we are very excited to have Megan from the Australian Maritime Museum to talk about marine food chains. So this is our next session in SciFest 2021. It's been an amazing week of science, and we are very excited to have you here, Megan. So yeah, show us about marine life cycles, food chains, I should say.
Oh, thank you, Karen. So hello, everyone, and welcome. I hope you've all been having an amazing science week and a great day full of lots of different amazing events presented by Virtual Excursions Australia. So as Karen said, my name is Megan and I work at the Australian National Maritime Museum. And so I am a museum educator, so I get to teach kids just like you, all lots of different topics, all about science, but also history and all of that sort of amazing stuff. So hopefully you'll be able to learn something new. And if you have any questions, we might have a chance to get to some of those at the end, or maybe through the middle too. Before I get too much further, I want to make sure that I do an acknowledgement of country. You probably hear this at school or when you go somewhere, but it's really, really important to the Australian National Maritime Museum. So we acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the Bamel, the earth, and the Badu, the water on which I work. We also acknowledge all traditional custodians of all the lands and the waters throughout Australia and pay our respects to them, their elders, and their culture, both past and present. And that's really important with what I'm going to talk to you guys today about, because I'm going to talk all about food webs. And of course, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across Australia have had quite an understanding of how these ecosystems work and how to be able to live with them sustainably. And that's a big part of what we can understand when we think about our food webs. Now, before I get too much further, you hopefully got an email with an activity sheet that you can actually use along with today's lesson. So it looks like this, and it has a whole lot of different animals that you can cut out. Now, if you have had a go at this, that is great. You are ready for the lesson today. I also encourage you to have some spare paper, some post-it notes and pens to be able to add your own animals in as well. The other thing is, even if you don't have a printer, you can draw your own animal cards. I've done some here, like a shark or some coral. And that's a great way. You can also add your own animals in as well. Because the big thing I want you to take away from today's lesson is actually that these food chains aren't just what's on the worksheet. They're so massive and so amazingly huge that we can keep adding and adding and adding the more we research about these animals. And hopefully when we're done, you can actually go away, keep researching some of these animals and keep expanding on your food web to include a huge number of different species from our amazing oceans. Now, the start of our food web is incredibly important. And that is the start of most food webs is actually an animal or a plant called plankton. And so plankton are a huge, diverse array of different plants and animals that are so small, we wouldn't be able to see them most of the time with our naked eye. And so I'm going to play you a little bit of a video about plankton, about their superpowers. And if you need to just take a moment to grab yourself some paper and some pencils, please feel free to do so while we watch this video. So one sec, let me share this and enjoy a quick video about plankton.
Meet plankton. Plankton are amazing. These microscopic marvels are key to life on our planet. In fact, without them, there would be no life in the oceans at all. Plankton live in aquatic environments and there are thousands of different species. The two main groups are plant plankton, or phytoplankton, and animal plankton, or zooplankton. But plankton also include protist, bacterioplankton, and vireoplankton. What makes them plankton? Well, they aren't very good at swimming. They mostly float or drift with the tides and currents. Diatoms and dinoflagellates, copepods, krill, jellyfish, these are all kinds of plankton. So what are their superpowers? Superpower 1. Plankton look like aliens. They have amazing and unusual bodies. Some move with their flagella, propellers, others with pseudopods, false feet, or some with cilia, tiny hair-like oars. Some of them have spines and shells to deter predators. Many have powers of invisibility. And some species glow. Architects and engineers have been inspired by plankton's elegant and geometric bodies. They are very strong and yet very lightweight, the perfect inspiration for all kinds of structures. Superpower 2. Plankton make their own underwater light shows as they bioluminesce. Dinoflagellates, krill, jellyfish, amphipods, arrowworms, and many other plankton create their own light. This is called bioluminescence, and we think it's to confuse predators or sometimes to attract a mate. Superpower 3. Plankton are rock stars. Literally, they are the base material for many stones and natural resources we couldn't live without. They could even be credited with the evolution of modern human civilization because the flint stone that early humans struck to produce fire is made up of silica-rich plankton bodies. A lot of the sedimentary rocks that we use for buildings and monuments are made up of long-dead plankton. Dead plankton also form natural gas and crude oil when they sink to the seafloor and are compressed over millions of years. Superpower 4. Move over, blue whales. Siphonophores, a kind of zooplankton, are actually the longest animal on the planet. The Schmidt Oceanographic Research Team recently discovered a siphonophore, a long jellyfish-like planktonic species, you can see here, off the coast of Western Australia that was 46 metres long, making it the longest animal ever seen. Superpower 5. These pint-sized planet protectors make the air we breathe. Plankton produce nearly 2/3 of the oxygen we breathe, more than all the rainforests on Earth. We often think about how good trees are, but have you thanked plankton lately? Many phytoplankton make their energy from photosynthesis. That means that, like other plants, they take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, add water, and use energy from the sun and the chlorophyll in their bodies to turn them into oxygen and sugars. Superpower 6. Plankton are ocean regulators. Plankton play a key role in cycling important chemicals through the ocean and removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It's even involved in forming clouds and making oil. Superpower 7. They are the most populous organism on the planet. If we just look at copepods, a kind of zooplankton, their biomass is 500 times that of the human population. Plankton also form the base of the entire marine food web. They enable us to have fish fingers and sushi to eat and beautiful whales to go watching and coral reefs to go snorkeling in and so much more. No other life in the oceans would be possible without them. Find me a plant or animal anywhere that has as many superpowers as plankton do. They are amazing.
Wow. So plankton not only has lots of amazing superpowers, but they also are the base of many of, or pretty much every single food web in the ocean. And so I'm now going to show you how we can take that information we just learned and turn that into our very own food web. And so Sorry, just let me get the right window in my computer up. So if we take plankton as part of our food web and we look at it as what we call a primary producer. So you should be able to see that here. I've actually put one of the many types of plankton over as the primary producer, the original, the start of our, what's going to start as quite a simple food web. And we're going to say that these diatoms are going to be eaten by some consumers, some krill. And so krill are, of course, eaten by a huge number of different animals. And in this case, they're going to be eaten by some penguins, because I'm going to say this particular food web is going to happen off the coast of Antarctica. And that's something that's quite important when we think about our food webs, is think about where our animals actually are. Because there's no point having a penguin eating a tropical type of fish, because penguins tend to like colder climates. So in this case, our penguins are going to be eating some krill, but then a leopard seal will come and eat the penguins. So this is how our food web, or at this point it's a food chain, is going to start working until we get through all of our consumers to an apex predator, that is our killer whale. So if you've got some of your animals out, you can actually put together this food chain yourself. And so we have everything from our primary producer through several layers of consumers all the way up to our apex predator, the killer whale. Now, it's not always that simple though, because we also have blue whales that come and eat the krill as well. Or we might have a seal that today feels like eating some squid. And we also have that the seabirds also might eat our plankton as well. So you can see it starts to get a little bit more complicated. Now, we don't just need to stick to the animals that are in our worksheet. What I'd love for you to do after this session is actually to go and research some animals for yourself and pick your own favorite animals to actually create a food web. So for example, one animal that I love is dugongs. So dugongs are, of course, off the coast of Australia, and they eat seagrass. And so dugongs are eating seagrass, and while the adults don't have any natural predators, the juveniles, the young, can get eaten by saltwater crocodiles and sharks. And so this is a bit of an example of how you can use your own pictures, use your own photos you might find on the internet or in books to create your own food webs. Now, we might actually just have a few moments to see if anyone has got any questions so far.
Hi, Megan. We haven't got any questions yet. So everyone, if you do have questions, please put it into the Q&A and Megan will answer those questions for you. Megan, I was listening to you before talking about plankton being there being so much of it. I've heard a lot about algae as well. Does that, and I've heard that there's lots of things that humans can use algae to do as well.
Yeah, so algae is, of course, a plant, and it is everywhere. It can get in our swimming pools, which we don't like. It's bad algae, but there's also lots of good algae as well. And if we think about science, so much of science now is actually researching these things like algae and actually working out if we can use them to help us. So researching something like algae, which is quite easy to grow, and there's huge numbers of different species, to actually work out if we can maybe use them as a food source or use them to make things. So all of these, understanding more about underwater animals is incredibly important. And one of my favorite facts about science is that we actually don't know a whole lot about our oceans. We know more about the moon than we do about the deepest parts of our oceans. And so that's a bit of an extra challenge. I haven't included a deep ocean food web in this presentation because it's so difficult for us to know all about these animals, but maybe that's a challenge that you guys would like to have a go at home.
We've got a question, and actually Samantha and Rachel both asked a very similar questions. What would happen if we took away plankton? And what would happen to the chain if it runs out?
So that is a great question, and that is one of the really important things of why it's important for us to understand food chains and food webs. If we took away all of the plankton, and plankton is one of the most abundant sources of life on the planet, if we took it all away, then what would the krill eat? And if the krill doesn't have anything to eat, there won't be any krill. So what would the blue whales or the penguins or the fish that all eat krill, what would they eat? So by understanding food webs and food chains, it actually helps us understand this very delicate balance that life on Earth is. However, we'd also have a problem if we had too much plankton. If we had too much of it, it would then be using all the resources so other animals wouldn't actually have as good a chance at surviving if there was too much of a certain animal. So the natural order of things is good at finding its own balance. And then as humans, we've got to be really aware that we don't go in and upset that balance.
We've also got a great question from Matthew. How do whales catch krill? They must need to eat a lot to get a full belly.
Yes, so there's actually two different types of whales. So there's some whales that don't eat krill and they have big teeth. So like a sperm whale has big teeth, doesn't eat krill because krill is really tiny. But the whales that eat krill are called baleen whales. And they're really fascinating. So if we look at our hair, think like that, but in your mouth. So they have baleen, which is very similar to hair, but a little bit different. And it basically strains out all of the krill. And so they swim with their mouth open, catch all the krill, the water, they get rid of the water. And they have to eat huge amounts of krill in a day. But that's how whales like blue whales actually get their food. So they don't have teeth at all. And this is really, really fascinating to get into how different animals evolved, and they've evolved different features, such as some whales having teeth and some whales having baleen. They evolve different features based on the type of food that they eat, and they become specialists at eating that particular type of food.
Megan, do let me know if you need to go on because we have
I'm enjoying these
questions.
I'm enjoying these questions. We've got about another 5 minutes before we can keep going.
Cool. Well, Ava and Brandon wanted to know, how are plankton born?
That is a very interesting question, and I'm actually not 100% sure of your answer. So there are huge amounts of different types of plankton. Some plankton are plants and some plankton are animals. And between all the different types of plankton, there would be a huge number of different types of reproduction, I can imagine. And so I think that is a massive question that I'm actually going to go away from this and research. And it'd be interesting if you guys at home wanted to do some research into as well. But I can imagine there'd be lots of different types depending on if they're plants or if they're animal plankton.
Phaeton wanted to know, actually it's Sakina. Sakina wanted to know, do all seals eat penguins?
No. So there are lots of different species of seals and some eat different types of things. So for that example, I was imagining it was a leopard seal, and leopard seals most definitely do eat penguins, but other types of seals don't. And so if you wanted to create a lot more accurate food web of Antarctica, a great resource would be to, for example, go on to the Australian Antarctic Division website, which I found had lots of great information on some of the animals that live there, like the different species of seals, and actually told you what the different species ate. So instead of just having one circle for seals, you could have multiple different circles for seals for the different species. Because yes, different species of seals all eat different things. It can also depend on their location. So whereabouts they are, because their prey may or may not also be in those locations. So yes, not all seals eat penguins, but leopard seals definitely do.
Rachel and Zoe wanted to know, are krill affected by microplastics in the ocean?
I would imagine that they probably are, but I'm not 100% sure of that. So microplastics in the ocean have huge, wide-ranging consequences that scientists don't fully understand yet. Another big thing about that is that animals are going to eat the microplastic thinking that they are krill, or thinking the krill themselves will also maybe potentially eat tiny particles of microplastic. So when the larger animals eat them, they're also ingesting that. And we don't fully understand the repercussions of all of that tiny little microplastic, but I can't imagine that it would be doing those animals any benefit at all. And it's probably actually quite harmful, particularly when you consider that humans are also often in these food webs as well. So I know not every human, but a lot of humans eat fish or fish products. We also eat products from other types of animals that are in our marine ecosystems as well. And so anything that impacts that ecosystem also does impact humans. So we have to be very aware of what's happening. And microplastics is something that we definitely need to monitor, and we definitely need to do a whole lot more science in to work out exactly its implications.
Gabe wanted to know, can plankton get really big?
So some plankton can get relatively big, and it gets into a point where it's a little bit of a fuzzy definition. Scientists love arguing about all the categories that they put animals into. So some scientists will consider, for example, jellyfish as plankton. And of course, jellyfish can get incredibly big. So because plankton is such quite a broad category with both plants and animals, definitely some of those species can get relatively big. But the majority of plankton, and particularly when we're talking about plankton as being that first step in a food chain or food web, we're thinking about the smaller plankton.
Alice had a question about what plankton eat. Do they eat coral?
All right, that's a great question. So some plankton, of course, if they're plants, they'll photosynthesize. And then many plankton will eat other plankton. And so we're going to get onto coral in a moment. So that's probably a great segue into the next part of my presentation. And we'll get back to the rest of the questions towards the end. But coral are really, really interesting. So coral are actually two organisms that are living together. So when we think about coral reefs, particularly the Great Barrier Reef, the largest reef in the whole world. It's so big you can see it from space. So the Great Barrier Reef and also smaller reefs all over Australia. And so I'm going to bring my screen back up so you can actually see a picture of an artificial reef in Sydney. So even around Sydney, even down, there are some reefs around Victoria, Western Australia, all around Australia are different reefs with different species of coral. And coral are a tiny little animal that live in a colony. So we often think of like ants living in a colony and all living together. Coral are a tiny little animal that lives in a colony, and they actually have a plant that lives under their skin. So coral have a tiny little plant called zooanthily that lives under their skin. And so coral do eat plankton, and I'm sure that some of the larger planktons could eat coral, could eat those coral polyps. But coral, they definitely do eat plankton by stinging them with tiny little tentacles. But they also get a huge amount of their energy from the zooanthally, the algae living in their skin. And that's what we call a symbiotic relationship. So we have our coral, and they actually do get about 90% of their energy comes from this algae that's living in their skin. And this algae, of course, gets that energy from photosynthesis from the sun. That's actually why we generally find coral in relatively shallow waters, because they need to have good sunlight. And I just said there that coral do also eat plankton by stinging them with their tiny little tentacles. And did you know that there is over 600 different species of coral just on the Great Barrier Reef? So just on the Great Barrier Reef in Queensland, there's over 600 different types of coral. And that gives us a huge amount of different shapes and sizes. Some of them are hard corals, some of them are soft corals. And they will eat slightly different things, and slightly different animals will eat them. So a great example of an animal that does eat coral is some types of fish. So for example, parrotfish and butterfly fish are just some of the species that will eat coral. But of course, they're not the apex predators. So they will be eaten by larger fish, by eels, and also sharks. So this is just some of the steps that you could make in a Great Barrier Reef food web. And you could add a huge number of different animals, different species. There's over 1,500 different species of fish on the Great Barrier Reef. There are sea snakes, seabirds as well that you could put in here. There's turtles. So of course we all love turtles. There's 6 different species of turtles on the Great Barrier Reef: whales, dolphins, sharks, and stingrays. But one species in particular that's on our coral reef is the crown of thorns starfish. So the crown of thorns starfish is actually an Australian native animal, but it's actually often not seen as being particularly helpful. It's actually really thriving in the slightly warmer water that scientists have been recording. It's multiplying very fast, and it eats coral. It's actually very destructive, and it eats and kills huge amounts of coral. We do know that some larger fish do eat crown of thorns starfish. And so some large fish will eat crown of thorns starfish, but if there are too many crown of thorns starfish and there's not enough of the larger fish to eat them, they will actually multiply and actually create a huge imbalance in this food web. And so that's something that's really important. If we get too many crown of thorns starfish, they're going to eat too much of the coral. If there's not enough coral, that means the parrotfish and the butterfly fish won't have a huge amount of food to eat. So it's actually really important that we think about how we might want to monitor and even potentially take charge of something like the crown of thorns starfish and help keep it in balance. And that's actually where scientists, but also inventors, come in. So I'm sure not everyone here just wants to be a scientist. Some people like making things and inventing things. And now I'm going to show you an invention that is actually helping the Great Barrier Reef. So if I stop that one, and it's going to pop up a different video. Okay.
My first experience with robotics actually didn't come until after university, when I became more conscious about the way that we exploit and protect the environment. How do we make sure we're not destroying the planet to the point where we can't recover? That was the light bulb moment for me. So then I came up with the idea for RangerBot. RangerBot is an underwater robot, what we call an autonomous underwater vehicle. It's been designed to monitor, protect, and also now restore our reef environments. The latest application for RangerBot is to be able to spread coral larvae onto damaged parts of the reef to actually help restore degraded reefs. We've been able to reseed 3 hectares in 6 hours with one robot. It's this feeling that you've created something that people need. They can benefit their own community. They have the same aspirations as me to provide a better future for their children, for their families. It would be a terrible shame to lose all this on our watch while we have the opportunity to make this difference. So I'm totally motivated to make sure that that's not going to happen.
So a robot like the RangerBot, as you just saw in the video, it can first off be used to help monitor something like the Great Barrier Reef. So humans can't be everywhere at once. So having robots to help us keep an eye out, see what's happening, record what's happening so we can have a look at it over time is really important. And then another really interesting thing that it can do is it can actually help seed coral. So if there's not enough coral because too much of it has been damaged, it can actually help spread coral spawns to actually make more coral. And the other thing it's been used for in the past is actually to help control the numbers of crown-of-thorns starfish. And so a robot like that can actually go through and count how many of a crown-of-thorns starfish are in an area. And if there's too many, it can actually kill some of them to help bring everything back into balance. So that's a small snapshot of a couple of different marine food webs, one in Antarctica a bit earlier, and then this one all about the Great Barrier Reef. And as I said, these are really simple ones. You can go a lot more complicated by doing your own research into the types of animals that interest you. And you can actually find a huge number of other different amazing food webs in our oceans. So we've got about 10 minutes or so left. So we're going to have some more questions. And
there are so many questions, Megan.
Oh, wonderful.
So we have a question here that asks, can we eat every kind of fish?
So that's a complicated question. So we probably could if we knew all about them and we knew, for example, which parts of the fish may be toxic. There are some fish that do contain toxins which are poisonous to humans. But I think the better question there is, should we eat every type of fish? And the answer is no. So when scientists are looking at these types at fish, there are some fish, for example, that are too small and don't have a huge amount of meat in them, so they wouldn't be worth catching and they wouldn't be worth eating. There are other fish that are endangered or might only be in certain areas. And so we definitely don't want to be catching and eating fish that are endangered or fish that are potentially not going to recover. And so that's why it's really important for us to understand these food webs, because then we can actually see if we're taking too much of one type of species or another. And because that would then have a flow on to all of the other animals in that food web. So we potentially could, but we wouldn't want to, and we definitely shouldn't eat every type of fish.
We have a couple of questions here about the robot. Vicky wants to know, how do they know the robot is not going to break, and what will happen if it does?
Well, I haven't worked on this robot particularly, like specifically, but in other stuff I have done with drones and things like that. We do have some underwater drones at the Maritime Museum, which I've had the pleasure of using. They do break. It happens. Normally, you would always make sure that you knew where it was, you'd have someone around. So even if it's doing its thing by itself on the ocean floor, you'd still be keeping an eye on it. So you'd know if anything went wrong. And most of the things that go wrong, it'll just stop working. So it's not like it's going to harm the reef in any way. And often it's things like motors, sensors, things like that. A lot of mechanics is actually, and the challenge to making a robot like this is that it's actually going to be in salt water all day. And if anyone has ever knows anything about electricity or motors or anything like that, it doesn't like water. Definitely do not put anything electric or battery powered anywhere near water unless it has been specifically designed for that purpose. Because water and electrical currents and circuitry and things doesn't really work well together. So from my experience working with drones, often it'll just be having to replace the motor, or doing little fixes like that to actually get it up and running again. There will also be some changes that you have to make in terms of its programming. Computers and robots will only do what we tell it to do. So it may also be tweaking that to get them working well. So, but I think this particular robot has had quite a few years of development, and so it's not likely to do huge damage or break in any catastrophic way.
Rachel wanted to know, how does the robot kill the crown of thorns starfish, and does it ever kill the wrong thing?
That is another great question. And so we actually know, scientists have worked out that they can kill crown of thorns starfish by injecting it with kind of like a saltwater brine solution. And so when I've seen this robot actually exhibited before, they've actually had a crown of thorns starfish next to it, and it actually has like a little needle that it shoots out to actually kill the crown of thorns starfish. Now, it has cameras and sensors that can actually detect the crown of thorns starfish, and the scientists that program that would be very aware of what other animals are in that ecosystem, particularly what other starfish are in that ecosystem, and actually program the kind of like facial recognition software, but program that type of software so that the robot would only recognize crown of thorns starfish.
Our next question is from a different Rachel and Oscar, and they want to know, how long can coral live for?
That is a wonderful question, and it varies. So of course, there's huge numbers of different species of coral, and some of them as a colony could live for an incredible amount of time. One of the most common type, the most well-known type of coral is staghorn coral, the ones that kind of look like a tree. And if we think about how big they can get, they can grow up to about 30 centimeters in a year. So they're kind of the shorter lived of some of the corals. Other types of coral actually grow a lot slower. So when I'm talking about growing, I'm talking about the skeleton. That's basically like the apartment building that all of the corals are living in. For hard corals, it's made of limestone, and they actually build it as they grow and they multiply. Those tiny little polyps will grow and multiply. So a colony, what we think of as a coral, which is a colony of tiny little corals, can live for an incredibly long time, as long as it doesn't suffer a huge amount of damage, or as long as the water doesn't heat up too much for an extended period of time. And actually, the biggest danger to our coral reefs is actually the water heating up. When the water heats up, coral actually gets sick. And its defense mechanism when it's sick is actually to get rid of all of that algae that's living under its skin. So it expels and gets rid of all of the algae that's under its skin. And that's what we call coral bleaching. That's why coral looks white when it's really hot. And as I said before, coral gets probably about 90% of its energy from the zooanthellae, from that algae under its skin. So if the coral, if the water stays too hot, the coral doesn't have any zooanthellae to help feed it, it will starve. And at the moment, that's actually what's the biggest danger and killing coral. However, if the water cools down again and the coral can get back some algae, start feeding again, start getting some energy again from the algae from the sunlight, then it can recover. And that's also where a robot like RangerBot is really useful, because after a coral bleaching event, if there's been lots of coral that have died, it can actually spread new coral, new living healthy coral to help replace it.
I reckon this is a really great question from Rachel and Zoe. What are some things that you think we can do at home to help the ocean life?
So the biggest thing that we can do is actually be interested. The more we're interested in something, the more we research and learn about it, but then also the more the scientists will actually go and learn about it and research about it, the more the politicians will help pay money and help us protect these environments. So the biggest thing we can do at home is actually just be interested and make conscious choices. When we're thinking about what to eat, we can research where the food comes from. We can research the animals that might have been around the food we eat. There are definitely logos and symbols that can be on our fish products, particularly to show that they've been sustainably sourced. And we can also just be conscious of living environmentally friendly lives. So not using a whole lot of plastic, and definitely trying to avoid the plastic ending up in the ocean. Because if an animal like a whole lot of turtles or a whole lot of seabirds decide to start ingesting a lot of plastic and they then die, once again, that disrupts that food chain. So things like litter and rubbish are some of the worst things for the food webs as well. So just living environmentally friendly lives, doing what you can to try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and just being aware, being interested. I know some of you may grow up to become scientists and engineers, actually researching these problems and coming up with really useful solutions to help protect all of our marine ecosystems and the food webs that exist within them.
We have a question that asks, can humans eat the crown of thorns starfish? I heard it is good to eat pests, then we don't need to fish as much and restock the fish supply.
Definitely. I personally haven't heard of any humans eating the crown of thorns starfish. It would be very interesting to find out if it was edible. I'm assuming it's an animal, so we probably could eat it. And definitely eating animals that are pest species in some areas is definitely quite a good thing. It would then be an interesting job to try and harvest it. So going and finding where it is. And remember, we don't want to kill all of the crown of thorns starfish. They are a natural part of the ecosystem. They are an Australian native animal. And so we want to kill just enough so that it gets back into balance, and they're not, there's not too many of them in a certain area. So that's a really interesting one, actually.
I think one very, very last question. Ava and Brandon wanted to know, do all jellyfish sting?
That is a great last question, because I don't know the answer to it. I think that's a great one for us to all go and take away and do a bit of our own research and start maybe thinking about a food web with jellyfish in it. I definitely know that different jellyfish stings are more or less, but a jellyfish's sting is actually one of the main way it eats. So when a jellyfish is floating along in the ocean, it's not a particularly good swimmer, and so it'll sting all those tiny little bits of food that it can then eat. So I would imagine most, if not all, jellyfish would sting, but I'm not actually 100% sure on that. And it's great. I love it when adults admit they don't know anything or don't know the answer to every single question we have, because scientists don't know the answer to everything we have. And we always want to learn more. And for those people who are in Sydney or are hopefully going to be able to visit Sydney in the near future, the Maritime Museum is going to open an exhibition once everything can reopen, all about our oceans. It's called One Ocean, Our Future. And it's going to open once all the museums can reopen in Sydney. So if you're interested in this sort of stuff, the Ranger bot that I just showed a video about is in that exhibition. And there'll be a lot more information about our oceans and about what we can do to help protect them. So I hope everyone has learnt something. And thank you so much for joining me to chat and all your amazing questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Megan. And it was wonderful to have you here. And I've certainly learned more about marine food chains as well. So thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye, everyone.